Our next speaker is Gary Marcus, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at NYU, founder of the AI startups Geometric AI and Robust AI, and author of New York Times bestselling books. As a leading voice in AI, he is examining today what the excitement around AGI might be costing us. Please welcome Gary Marcus.
Thank you very much. The title of the talk is The Grand AGI Delusion. I don't often use LLM-generated art except to make fun of it, and I kind of did that here. Usually I prefer to license things. This is an actually licensed cartoon. That was how we used to keep our artists in business. And it's to signify in part that this talk was adapted from a talk I gave last week at the 75th anniversary of Alan Turing's famous Turing test. And so you'll see traces of that throughout the talk. Those in the front row will see that Ray Kurzweil's daughter did this cartoon about the Turing test today, which I think is hilarious. I want to start by a little bit of context setting, which is to remind people that generative AI, which is about 98% of the mind share in AI right now, and 98% of the media and 98% of the funding, is just part of what we could imagine AI being. It's popular right now. LLMs, large language models themselves, are really just a subset of machine learning. There have been many techniques in machine learning over the years. I mean, you could count regression, certainly random forest and so forth. Some of those still have their uses. And machine learning is just a subset of artificial intelligence. I'm going to be very critical today of generative AI in a bunch of ways. That doesn't mean that I'm not a fan of AI. I want AI to succeed. I think that AI could help us with science, with medicine, with technology, with education, and so forth. I just don't happen to think that generative AI is maybe the right way to get there. So first part of this talk is about Turing, Eliza, which I hope everybody in this room knows, that was invented just a few blocks from here, and a kind of lesson that I don't think has been learned. So if you go back to the original Turing test paper, which is now 75 years old, the first sentence asks a really interesting question, which is, can machines think? I would say we still haven't fully answered that question, and that it went from being an academic question in Turing's time to maybe being one of the most important questions in society right now, because we are resting so much on the notion that LLMs can think, which I think is misguided. But we have trillion-dollar investments in LLMs because some people think that they can think. And we're doing things like exempting them from any kind of regulation, handing over artists' IP, all on the notion that, hey, we've solved thinking and so forth. We're changing the whole world on the assumption that LLMs can in fact think, which I think is arguable. Okay, so I would say Turing's question is still really important, even if Turing's test is maybe not that significant. Turing's test, I assume everybody in this room knows, is basically you have a person, there's actually 9 different versions if you go back and read the test, but abstractly it's, you know, can a machine fool a person into thinking that the machine is a person? And I think that just doesn't turn out to be very useful in trying to get machines to be intelligent. And we've actually known that since 1966 from Eliza. If you haven't already played around with Eliza, you should do it at least once in your life. Eliza was a psychiatrist, basically, or was a simulation of a psychiatrist. It was a really dumb simulation of a psychiatrist, almost deliberately dumb. It was just doing keyword matching, but some people fell for it. Our brains did not evolve to discriminate humans from imposters, from software that might emulate humans, and people were pretty easily fooled. But this didn't teach us anything about AI. It taught us something about psychology. You know, Eliza wasn't a step towards artificial general intelligence. There's nothing in Eliza that, you know, we still, you know, are particularly excited about. So I call this the Eliza effect, where a machine can fool us into thinking that it's a person. Most of the systems that have actually beat the Turing test haven't taught us anything about AI. So there was one called Parry that behaved like it was paranoid, and that fooled people, but so what? There was another one called Eugene Gustman that passed some version of the Turing test 11 years ago, I guess. And I wrote an article about it in the New Yorker at the time, and I said, this won't teach us anything about AI. And it didn't. You're not going to take any, you know, lectures on how AI works and learn anything from how Eugene Gustman worked. It was a bunch of heuristics, and it was a kind of invented personality of a 13-year-old boy from Odessa. and who was a smart aleck. And the idea was that would cover up the fact that it didn't really know anything by making wisecracks and so forth. Really didn't teach much. The reason I'm telling you this is because what I would call chatbot mania reflects a profoundly dangerous echo of the Eliza effect. We as a society are placing these huge bets that AGI is close. And we promote things like, let's say, AGI 2027. We're not going to have artificial general intelligence by any reasonable definition, where it means something like AI with the flexibility of human beings by 2027. It's not going to happen. But we're behaving as a society as if we think that it was. In reality, LLMs are just deeply flawed imitators that prey on the Eliza effect. They were built in some ways deliberately to try to fool people into thinking they're people. They talk in the first person. They at least used to type things out one word at a time so it looked like a person. You have the whole representation in the machine, but you type it out word by word to make it look more like a person. If policymakers and the public had a better, more nuanced understanding of what thinking actually is, I think we'd be placing very different bets. And it's not just money that's at stake. We're letting those who build LLMs dictate the structure of society, and without much regard to the cost. We're giving AI, or governments are giving AI companies almost an entirely free rein with essentially no liability for what they do. We're casting a blind eye to the environmental cost, to bias, to wholesale generated misinformation, LLM-induced delusions and suicides, which are becoming a bit more common. We're considering creating exemptions from copyright law at a mass scale. We are enabling companies that might surveil and analyze absolutely everything that you do. Right? The new browser from OpenAI is just one example where not only does it take down the websites that you visit, but it takes down the whole screen of everything that you do. We're amping up geopolitical tensions. Everybody's like, we have to beat China. What do we have to beat China to? To GPT-5? Like I used to joke before GPT-5 came out, so what? If China gets GPT-5 first, what are they going to do? Invade Taiwan with a hallucination generation machine? I mean, really, if they get there first, they're just going to write boilerplate text faster than us. And then GPT-5 came. It didn't make any difference in the geopolitical situation. We're like making these bets around chips and blah, 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 all around this assumption that AGI is imminent. And we're handing absolutely unprecedented political power to tech CEOs. I mean, we had one of them basically in the White House for a few months there. And the tech CEOs are basically calling all the shots. Okay, so LLMs are in fact good imitators, but that doesn't make them intelligent. There's a recent article on Archive that argues that they actually pass the Turing test. Now, I was trained as a cognitive psychologist. I can look at the abstract and give you some quibbles. I can say the tests were only 5 minutes, the judges weren't trained, but there's a real result. I mean, they really are passing at least some version. But so what? It's just another case of us falling into the Eliza trap, over-attributing intelligence to machines because they happen to be good enough to fool people who have not taken cognitive psychology classes and don't know how to interrogate these things. But in reality, anyone who studies these systems know they still regularly do stupid things. So I had a New York Times op-ed. I've had two lately. One this was from the September op-ed in the New York Times, where I made fun, for example, the notion that we had solved the 5 fingers problem. Right? Remember, DALL-E would make 6 fingers. Well, they so overtrained on this stuff that when I said, "Make me Sam Altman with 3 arms sweeping the word scaling under a rug," it came back with 5 arms. They haven't really solved these problems. The one on the right is draw 5 clocks showing the same time between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. And every single one of the clocks that it drew had 10:10 because that's the thing they put on the Rolex and the advertisements because it looks nice. There's not a deep conceptual level understanding of what time is, what the number 5 or 3 is, what an elephant is, etc. Since we're at MIT, I thought I'd have an electrical engineering example. Those of you who took a little E will recognize this as a short circuit. This is not, in fact, the way that you wire a North American plug unless you want to, kill yourself or set the place on fire. So I fed this into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT gave me a corrected version. Those who will sitting in the front row will see that one wire was replaced by another wire of a different color, but it was still a fire hazard. I don't know if we have any biologists in the room, but this is definitely a new theory of the cell, right? These things can make stuff that looks generally correct. Like to a non-biologist, all right, I guess this is okay. To an actual biologist, this is absurd. And my favorite examples right now are the so-called river crossing problems. And what I like about them is they illustrate the fundamental problem here, which is these systems mimic things without having a deep understanding of what's going on. And what happens is somebody like me or Colin Fraser, who's very good at tormenting these machines, come up with some example where the system does something incredibly stupid. And they start to patch the systems. They give them a bunch of examples so they won't make this stupid error that is circulating on Twitter or something like that. Now they even literally have in their system prompts how to deal with river crossing problems. And it still doesn't work, right? This one is a tall man and a short woman. You know these things like there's the goat and the cabbage and the wolf and whatever, have to get across to the other side. So this was a tall man and a short woman carrying some cabbage are at one bank of a river with a boat, need to get to the other side. Where's the hungry goat? Where there is a hungry goat, what should they do? And it says row across and hand the goat the cabbage. Like, where does that come from? Like, it comes from like, they have seen a bunch of problems that are vaguely like this. It's not in the instruction of the problem. They don't really understand what's going on. Okay, now to some people, these kinds of errors might seem surprising because a lot of people attribute a lot of intelligence to LLMs. They think they're smart, but they're not. And these errors don't surprise me. I wrote an article in 1998, which I think was my most important piece of work and which nobody paid any attention to whatsoever at the time, about what I call distribution shift. And the point of this article was that if you trained a neural network, kind of ancestors to today's LLMs, on a set of simple examples, it would not only memorize these examples, but it would generalize a little bit. But crucially, I distinguish between two kinds of generalization, which I called within distribution generalization and out of distribution generalization. And what I showed is that the further the systems had to generalize, the more the results failed. And the argument was they didn't learn anything really abstract. They were just learning to generalize to the things near the ones they'd seen before. And I turned that into a book called The Algebraic Mind in 2001, published by MIT Press. And the point of that book, in part, was that some of what humans learn and some of what we would want our AI systems to learn is much more abstract than that. It's like a mental algebra. And that was actually where I first started writing about hallucination errors. I said that these systems lack a good way of representing individuals separately from the kind of bundles of properties that those individuals have, and that you were going to get overgeneralizations. And we still have hallucinations a quarter century later. Like I keep hearing over and over, just give us a little more data, another $1 trillion worth of GPUs, and we will solve this problem or that problem. I keep seeing the same problems over and over. It's gotten to the point where people kind of mock how long this is going on. Apple had this important paper over the summer, which really extended my 1998 results in a very direct way. And a famous venture capitalist wrote on Twitter, Apple just Gary Marcused LLM reasoning ability. So it's like a thing now. A new thing comes out. I don't have to do this anymore. Other people do it. Apple does it. The alternative, I forgot to tell you I have audio, so we'll see how well this works. But the alternative view has been scaling is all we need. We just need to add more scaling. Watch the rhetoric, maybe I can do it with the mic here, of Sam Altman trying to convince you that scaling is a law of the universe, which it is not. Scaling is actually something that worked for a little while, but it was an empirical generalization, like Moore's law. Moore's law is not a generalization of the universe. It's just something we could do for a while, and then we couldn't anymore. So listen to him. Can I get some volume?
Hugely expensive in terms of people and time and dollars and everything else.
Maybe I can rewind it. I'm going to try to rewind it so you can hear the whole thing. Okay, here we go.
This whole effort, which was hugely expensive in terms of people and time and dollars and everything else, was an experiment to further validate that the scaling laws keep going.
Yeah.
And why? And turns out they do. And they probably keep going for a long time. I accept scaling laws like I accept quantum mechanics or something, but they still don't, I still don't know why. Why should that be a property of the universe?
Because it isn't, right? He's just trying to sell you this story. It is not a property of the universe. There's nothing that holds this true. Okay, I'll come back to scaling in a minute, but I want to touch on something related, which is the bitter lesson. How many of you have heard of Rich Sutton's bitter lesson? It's pretty well known in the field, and it's been kind of gospel that has animated $1 trillion worth of investment. So in this famous article, and the article is only a page and a half. If you're in the front row, you can actually sit here and read the article and tune out and not pay attention to me. That's the entire article. But the idea of the article was basically that big data and compute always wins. The article pointed to some examples where big data was actually more efficient than doing human engineering and so forth. And to a remarkable extent, what Sutton said held true for some years. Scaling did drive most of the progress, not all, from 2019 to, like, let's say 2024. But there's a problem with the argument, and I will get to it. And then I'll show you something that sort of astonished me. So to me, the scaling assumption never made sense. I wrote an article in 2022 where I said, hold on, I understand scaling's been working for a little while, but this is not going to hold. And just adding more data to this architecture is not going to solve problems of truthfulness, reasoning, common sense. And I said, scaling laws are not universal laws. They're more like observations that might not hold forever, like Moore's law. So I wrote this, and that was the point at which I was excommunicated from the field. Up until then, I got invited to conferences and stuff like that. And everybody not important, everybody well-known in the field went after me. Importance, could be evaluated in different ways, but Sam Altman went after me, Elon Musk went after me, Jan LeCun went after me. LeCun said not only is AI not hitting a wall, but cars powered by AI aren't either. Sam Altman, because he thought he was so clever, took the art from my cartoon, fed it into DALL-E, and he said, give me the confidence of a mediocre deep learning skeptic. And these things got millions of views on Twitter or whatever. Over the last year, scaling actually lost momentum. And the first person, I think, to publicly acknowledge that was Satya Nadella, who said in a Microsoft Ignite talk, words that could have been cribbed from my paper, basically. He said, in the last multiple weeks, there's been a debate. Have we hit a wall with scaling laws? Is it going to continue? And the thing to remember at the end of the day is these are not physical laws. It was, in my mind, a huge concession from a field that had been basically built on the premise of scaling to acknowledge this. And then Llama 4 came out, and thanks. Llama 4 came out, and it was disappointing. And Grok 4 came out, and it was disappointing. The people in the field had persuaded themselves that some mathematical law was going to tell them when they were going to get to artificial general intelligence. And it became clear it wasn't true. And then the thing that kind of really changed a lot of people's opinions, and I think changed how they viewed me as well, is I kept saying GPT-5 is going to be late, and GPT-5 is going to be disappointing. And it was. I mean, it was partly disappointing because it had been sold as AGI. Altman kept for 3 years hinting that he knew how to build AGI. He wrote something on Reddit about how AGI had been achieved internally and then said it was a joke. But he kept teasing that they were close to AGI. And then at the actual presentation of it, he said it could do anything a PhD could do. It took people about an hour and a half to realize that that was not true. There are lots of things that high school students or 6-year-olds could do that it couldn't. And at that point, people finally realized they had been sold a bill of goods. This was August 7th. I will remember for a long time because it really did transform my life. In hindsight, the bitter lesson about the bitter lesson is that scaling works well only for some problems, mainly pattern recognition problems, but not others. So it helps with object recognition, it helps with autocomplete, it helps with voice recognition, it helps with brainstorming, but it doesn't help with open-ended problems that can't be beaten by brute force. It doesn't help with the problem of distribution shift that I talked about and so forth. Scaling has made generative AI much better at what it's good at, but not helped with its core weaknesses around reliability, hallucinations, poor reasoning, poor planning, challenges from novelty, and so forth. That's the reality about the bitter lesson. And people are catching on. Like, here's Eric Topol, who's been very much a booster of AI in medicine, acknowledging just a couple of weeks ago that beating benchmarks is not the same thing as working well in clinical practice. Part of what's going on is the systems are training to the benchmarks. They're memorizing augmented data that's near the benchmarks and all this kind of stuff. But they're not really understanding medicine. And then here's the most astonishing thing that happened in my career, literally. It just happened a couple weeks ago. Sutton, who is the man behind the bitter lesson, conceded to me. He said, you were never, and he was incredibly gracious. He said, you're never alone, Gary, though you were first to bite the bullet, to fight the good fight and make the argument well. And again, for the limitations of LLMs, I salute you for this good service. This is incredible change in the field to have someone like Sutton acknowledge that bitter lesson, at least with LLMs, is not actually working. to bring this a little bit back to Turing, imitation is not actually the essence of intelligence. That was Turing's hypothesis. It turned out to be wrong. It was a reasonable hypothesis in 1950, but now we know it's not. Explorations in LLMs have shown empirically that you can have a system that's spectacular at imitating humans' intelligence in certain ways, and yet still in some circumstances utterly discomprehending. I don't know if any of you have read Oliver Sacks' wonderful books about neurology and the crazy deficits that people have, depending on a stroke in a particular area. But LLMs are like that. Like, they'll do some things really, really well, and others you're like, how could you exist on this planet in your silicon form and still get that wrong? The economic implications of overinvesting in scaling may be enormous. So, we're literally building or talking about building $1 trillion data centers. And there are lots of other implications here too. The environmental implications are enormous. Altman, who's clearly megalomaniacal, wants 250 gigawatts of power to serve these data servers. And then there's the whole issue of extracting all of this stuff from creators and publishers, and they want it all for free. The payoff so far has actually been pretty minimal. Maybe some people in this room were involved in the study showing that 95% of AI investments by big corporations have not returned on investment. There was a great paragraph a friend of mine wrote for the Financial Times. The biggest US listed companies keep talking about artificial intelligence, but other than this fear of missing out, few appear to be able to describe how the technology is actually changing their business for the better. And then there's a new word was just coined a few weeks ago, spread very, very rapidly because it's so dead on, which is work slop, which is AI-generated work content that masquerades as good work, but lacks the substance to meaningfully advance a given task. Well, that's what I'm telling you is LLMs are really good at masquerading at whatever they're doing, but they're often superficial. And so what's happening now is that lazy people take their output and they say, I'm done, and it's often a mess. That's part of why we're not getting the productivity. Then there's an estimate that says that all of these companies collectively are going to lose $800 billion. That's a lot of money to lose by 2030. Very few of them are actually making a profit. NVIDIA is making a profit, and it looks like the music one, Suno, is actually making a profit. But almost nobody else besides NVIDIA is. And then a lot of the things that were initially exciting people are actually possibly losing steam. In my Substack yesterday, I wrote a piece called 5 Signs That Generative AI is Losing Traction. And it had various charts, all of which kind of had the same pattern, which is people get really excited about something like using generative AI to so-called vibe code. This is the idea that amateurs can just feed stuff in, feed in a prompt and get the code that they want. And they try it, and then eventually they discover that it makes a big mess that they don't know how to fix. And so, enthusiasm was going up, but now it's going down again. And then Eric Brynjolfsson, who used to be here, shared something on Twitter with somebody else's study showing that generative AI uses may be falling off a little bit. So, all of these things are premised on two kinds of scaling or extrapolation, I guess I should say. One is the scaling laws notion that we will get such and such performance just by throwing in this much data and these many chips. So I would call that the scaling law fallacy. And then there's also been a kind of thing, I guess I have a laser pointer, that each of these graphs, let's see, how do I do? Whoops, we don't want to do that though. This one? That all these graphs would just go up and up and up indefinitely. And that's a fallacy too, right? That's another kind of extrapolation fallacy. So I posted something on Twitter yesterday inspired by the conjunction of these two kinds of wild over extrapolations that are driving wild investments. I had no idea how popular it would be, but I said this was absolutely the most important satire of the LLM era. It got another 1 million views since I sent in my slides this morning. So that was almost 3 million views. And what it was a joke from Christian Kyle, who I think is a programmer maybe. He says, my 3-month-old son is now twice as big as when he was born. So he's on track to weigh 7.5 trillion pounds by age 10. This is basic, like that level of superficial reasoning that he is mocking is basically driving the entire generative AI industry right now, right? It's naive extrapolation. Like, why doesn't your baby become 7.5 trillion pounds? Well, it turns out there's, a number of factors involved, like how much food is available and what the biology is and so forth. That's what we're seeing is naive extrapolation. I'll just, put in a factor of 10 more data and I'll have magic intelligence. Or because the first 10 months that this product was out, it was going this fast, it's like, it's almost like they're estimating that there'll be 3 trillion active users when we don't have 3 trillion active people on the planet. There's a classic 1841 book that you should all at least know about called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of the Crowds. And its most famous example is tulip mania, which you should know about if you don't. When in Holland in 1634, everybody was buying tulips. They were spending more and more money on the tulips. And I'm a little bit behind schedule here. I'm going to go over a couple minutes. But I think that this will be replaced soon enough. There will be need a second edition of this, which we'll call LLM mania. Okay, so what would be better? I think that we should turn to the cognitive sciences. I think almost all of AI has been driven by machine learning, and most of the people in machine learning focus on a particular bit of linear algebra that they know well. And I think that's too narrow a basis to build intelligence. I think the thing you need to know about intelligence is there is no one way that the mind works, because the mind is not one thing. Instead, the mind has parts, and different parts of the mind operate in different ways. My favorite quote about cognitive science from Chaz Firestone and Brian Scholl. And the point is we should stop looking for silver bullets. People, for 75 years in AI, keep looking for one mechanism, one learning mechanism or whatever that's going to solve everything. That's not going to happen. The very idea of artificial general intelligence might not even be the right idea. Turing's paradigm was a single general purpose QA system, but that's what he thought about it, 75 years ago. He'd actually built a dedicated piece of software for chess himself, but that paradigm became popular. LLMs try to fit that bill, but they appear to be jacks of all trade and masters of none. As a result, they haven't lived up to their promise, especially, I think, in advancing science and medicine. Jerry Fodor, who I think was at MIT at the time, wrote a book called Modularity of Mind, arguing that the human mind, anyway, is made up of specialized circuits, he called them modules, and perhaps AI systems should be as well. And it turns out some of the best results in AI have in fact come from highly modular systems. My most recent op-ed last week in the New York Times was about this. So AlphaFold actually is very specialized for a single kind of task and has lots of subcomponents that are themselves specialized for particular tasks. It's not trying to be a one purpose, one size fits all kind of thing the way that chatbots are. Narrow AI might also help with alignment concerns. So you may know that a lot of people are worried about what AI is going to do to us, and they're worried about deception and jailbreaking and so forth. You don't have that problem with these specialized systems. So AlphaFold is not going to, recommend that you suffocate everybody in the next room or whatever, like as chatbots actually have. Until we have a better solution, a robust solution to the alignment problem, a retreat to narrower focused AI might actually be essential for safety. The second clue from the human mind is we probably should be trying to bridge the gap between neural networks, which resemble Kahneman System 1, if you know that famous distinction, Kahneman System 1 versus System 2. We need to kind of bridge that gap. You can think about it this way. There's generative AI and there's classic symbolic AI. Generative AI is like Kahneman System 1. It's good at learning, but it's also poor at reasoning. It's data hungry. It's uninterpretable. It's prone to hallucinations. I'll go on. It has as an advantage that it's scalable, but it has a number of problems. And the advantages of System 2 and of symbolic AI are almost complementary. Good at reasoning, but poor at learning, data efficient, interpretable, hallucination free, but it's handcrafted, and that's really a pain. It seems obvious that the human mind combines both, and we should be trying to combine both in AI. And it's only kind of a sociological history of different people in different disciplines competing with one another that has kept us from doing better on that. The third is we should embrace the thoughtful use of innate structure. Liz Spelke, who teaches at Harvard and taught briefly at MIT, once made an argument that I love. She basically said if children are born with the ability to perceive some basics like objects, persons, sets, places, then they can go learn about the particular details of those people, the sets, those objects, and so forth. But if you don't start with that, then how do you bootstrap your way into the system? And I think what LLMs are a huge investment in the opposite of what she was saying. She's saying you should start with a bunch of stuff so you can bootstrap your way there. LLMs try to start with nothing, no real knowledge of the world, and try to figure out everything from there, and they just don't. If you look again at systems like AlphaFold, they actually have a lot of innate structure. They build in, all the structure of this system. They build in input representations for nucleotides and output systems for three-dimensional objects. They're not trying to do everything just from raw sensation or something like that. I think we should also focus on world models, in particular how to acquire them. So my example of this is chess. There's something deeply wrong with LLMs, which you can see in chess, right? Chess, the rules, except for one little thing I won't go into, haven't changed in 2,500 years. They're incredibly stable. They're available on Wikipedia. There are millions of games you can look at. And yet LLMs don't really learn to play chess. They can fake their way through it. They're kind of universal imposters that can fake anything. You can play chess if you stick to the popular sets of moves, the popular openings. They may do okay for a little while, but eventually they make illegal moves. They can tell you that a queen can't jump over a knight, but they'll actually make a queen jump over a knight because they don't actually have a representation of the board or the rules. What we need is a way that you can say, look in this room and build a representation inside a system of what's in the room. Might not have to be complete, but world models are essential to how humans think. I think they're essential to how AI might think. Just the last couple of slides. Having given this talk in the anniversary of Turing, I wanted to kind of make a contrast between how he thought about some things and how the field is. I think right now, the tech CEOs are convinced that they're gods, and the media plays into this and treats them as if they're gods. And so you get craziness, like Sam Altman said this a couple weeks ago. He said, over the next year or two, GPU scarcity could force painful trade-offs like cure cancer versus have free global education. And I made this slide maybe 3 weeks ago. I was kind of annoyed. I was like, none of this is remotely plausible. To actually solve cancer, you have to do laboratory work, for example. If he knew anything at all about how medicine actually works, he would know there's no way we can cure cancer in the next year or two. We might have a cure for one or two things, but it'll take time to roll out and so forth. So after I was getting ready to kind of rip him a new one, then we found out what he would actually do, this god. What he would actually do is to build a competitor to TikTok, which was driven entirely by generative AI. Like, why are we letting these people decide these things for society? And then, of course, I made this slide a few weeks ago, and then it got worse. He put out a mental health announcement, you can see at the top, and snuck in at the bottom what he's really going to do with all of those chips. He's not going to cure cancer. He's not going to fix education. He's going to make what he calls erotica, which I think is an awfully generous word for verified adults. Great. And it's not just Altman. Dario Amodei is running around saying that there's a 25% chance that things could go really, really badly with AI. Maybe there's a 75% chance it will turn out well. And he's deciding for that, deciding for us that. He's betting the species for a 3 out of 4 shot that he will become obscenely wealthy. Did you get a vote? Turing was much more modest, as scientists should be. The last 2 sentences of this famous paper is, well, I'll highlight them. Again, I don't know what the right answer is, but I think both approaches, it doesn't matter what they were, should be tried. We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can still see that plenty needs to be done. That's the reality now. There's still plenty more that needs to be done. Let's stop treating these people like gods. Let's look more critically, and let's come up with some new ideas instead of prematurely declaring that things are over. Oh, one last slide, which bring to go full circle. Generative AI is pretty well explored. There's a huge space of possible solutions to AI that we're not thinking about. I hope I've opened your minds. Thank you very much.
Hi, Mickey Siegel. Instead of looking for general intelligence, should we really be seeing the LLMs as providing a general interface for neurosymbolic programs that could all operate and interact and so forth?
I mean, to some extent, that's happening. I don't think it's happening in the best way, but I have a Substack I wrote recently called How O3 and Grok 4 Accidentally Vindicated Neurosymbolic AI. And there's a graph in it that I took from the Grok 4 presentation that Elon Musk gave, where it shows that is basically getting a saturation by adding more data. And what value they're getting now is from what they call tools. And what they call tools are basically symbolic tools. They're code interpreters and calculators and things like that. That's really what's bringing the advantage right now. I don't think it's enough. I think leaving the LLMs in charge of the natural language interface has a problem, which is they are very superficial. And so what's happened, for example, when people have done things like put Wolfram Alpha inside of these systems is they get a bunch of things right, but they get a bunch wrong because their comprehension of the world and of the questions is still pretty superficial. I think in the end of the day, we're probably not going to do things that way. It's a sort of good Band-Aid right now, but I think ultimately we need to say, LLMs don't really have a semantics. They don't really understand what they're talking about. We need systems that have a richer semantics, and that should drive maybe some combination of the systems in ways we haven't figured out yet.
Thank you. Could you please talk more about the quantum computing and together with AI, like Google's announcements yesterday?
I missed Google's announcement yesterday, so what did they say?
But I mean, generally, like, do you think that quantum computing could have return on investments as they talk about it, or like?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, I'm not an expert on quantum computers. I have some understanding about them. I wrote about them once upon a time. My general feeling, kind of watching what's happened with metaverse and generative AI and so forth, is that people like to hype these things, long before they're really ready for prime time. I would never expect quantum computing to replace general purpose computing. Like, you have to cool these things. You're not going to put them in your phone. You're not going to use it for most of what you do. Their application is really for a certain set of problems, like traveling salesman problems and certain kinds of optimization problems. And then the question is, like, will that ever become economically efficient to do so? How much will it matter? The big thing that everybody is worried about is, will it break encryption? There are some solutions that people have contemplated that might, be able to work. It might be a big mess for a while. If quantum computation comes. There are some people thinking about, can quantum computation speed up machine learning? For a lot of the problems that I care about, that doesn't necessarily matter, because the problems that I care about, like the hallucinations, the reasoning, and so forth, the problem is the kinds of algorithms we're using. If you ran those algorithms faster, you still have the same problems. So it would undoubtedly have impact, but it wouldn't necessarily fix the things I'm worried about. So we'll see how quickly people can make these things, sort of financially efficient as opposed to just lab demonstrations.
So let me ask the next question. So, you've sort of raised this idea that if we looked across a whole bunch of tasks, there are going to be some of these tasks where you say, this is kind of a pattern recognition task. These systems should be good. We maybe should see scaling laws kind of things, but there may be some areas that there aren't. Could we, if we stepped back and looked at some database of tasks, ONET or some other way of doing this, how would we partition tasks to know what falls into these different categories?
So in principle, that's a good idea. There's an important asterisk that makes it hard. So back in the old days, when open still meant open, I saw part of the last talk, we actually knew what was in the systems and how they worked. And so an external observer, like a scientist, could do experiments and say, is this in the training set? Is it not? And look at what's going on. Now, in this very closed world, it's very hard to know what a particular system is going to do and why it's going to do it. So for example, when a current system does well on a math problem, you don't know whether that's because that math problem is actually in the training set. And there was a huge example of this a day ago I'll talk about. Or whether there was maybe some synthetic data, well, so then it's also in the training set, or whether the system has actually done something intelligent there. It's very hard to know from the outside. The crazy manifestation of this the other day is that Sebastian Buback at OpenAI said, look at this. The GPT-5 has solved a bunch of open ERDOS math conjectures. And it turned out that really what it had done was kind of like web search, that those particular problems, the answers basically were already there. And so like from the outside, you don't really know what's going on. So in principle, what you describe is legit, but we have a bit of trouble assessing the actual situation. I think you can still do this to some extent. You can ask, at least as like rules of thumb, is this problem one in which there's a lot of change over time, for example? If there is, then LLMs might not be, your tool. LLMs are really good at what you might call stationary distributions over time. Things don't change very much. But like even chess actually poses some problems for them. So there's some things they can do this way. But we don't actually know that well how they work, and we don't we know how to build them, but they're not like closed form equations, and they're not stable, right? They're stochastic, and so nobody really knows what's going to come out. I started thinking about the Forrest Gump line about life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. LLMs are like a box of chocolates. You never really know what you're going to get, and so it's hard to make strong generalizations. Like if your exact problem is in the training set, it's probably going to get it right. But how do you know whether your exact problem was in the training set? And so I think we can do some things. We can have some guidelines around this, but I don't think we can be anywhere near perfect. It's very different from a calculator, right? A calculator has a domain of application. You can be 100% sure that the calculator is going to get things right within its domain of application. There's some interesting things about largest number it can represent and so forth. But calculators just work. And LLMs, it's always a crapshoot.
So, but presumably we could at least look at this in terms of adoption, right? So even if like a particular math problem is done, if you looked broadly across different fields of mathematics and you saw in some areas it's being really useful, in some areas not, hopefully that would allow you to separate out a little, like there are a few dots of knowledge in this space versus good.
I mean,
representation.
part of what you're describing is you can take an empirical approach. You can see what works for you, and people are doing that. But I think people find it hard to come up with more than just like guidelines. Like it tends to be good at these kinds of problems rather than like hard constraints. If I have any arithmetic problem with multiplication, division, parentheses, I know the calculator will be able to do it. It's very hard to make strong rule it in cases like that. And then another factor is like how tolerant am I for error? So, what if the LLM is 80% correct at such, like making up examples for brainstorming? That's probably great if it's 80%. But if you're doing some medical thing, 80% might not be that great. So you also have to factor in the cost of error in a system that's fundamentally a little bit unpredictable.
So thank you so much. This was such an interesting talk. But I guess maybe it's related to the point that Neil was raising. The bar you and a lot of the commentators are setting are really, really high, this AGI, right? But insofar as, again, going back to these examples that we do think they are reasonably good at, a lot of the work we do might end up having that kind of nature, right? A lot of work could actually be work slop. And so, I mean, I guess if you're now lowering that bar and thinking about how impactful these tools would be, maybe the answer would be a little bit different, right? It
Sure.
could be that.
So I'll clarify a couple of things. First of all, although I am one of the people who have set the AGI bar, the industry has set that bar too, right? I mean, Altman has talked about AGI nonstop for the last 4 or 5 years until after GPT-5 came out, and he said, maybe the AGI is not that important. Once it became clear he didn't actually have it, but he's pushed hard on it, and I think it's a reasonable question. It's certainly a reasonable academic question. Is there utility in these models? Clearly, yes, in some domains. There's a big gap between utility and AGI. I think an important thing, though, is that there are many problems where you want a trustworthy answer. And trust is really the key issue with LLMs. They're just really difficult to trust or should not be trusted in most cases. And so what we're finding now is a lot of corporations are trying it. They get a demo that looks pretty good, a kind of proof of concept, but they see that it's not working that well. And a lot of people rested a lot of hope on GPT-5. So they would do these demos. They'd say, we kind of get the answers we want. It's not that reliable, but it shows this will be, we'll get there. And then they thought GPT-5 would clean all that up. And what I think a lot of people have realized over the last couple of months is that that's not happening. And so now we have to decide empirically, and I think a lot of detail for very specific problems, is there really any ROI here? And not that many people are finding that much ROI because the outputs are often really not that great.
Thank you. So you talk about the neurosymbolic architectures, and that seems pretty historically representative of the AI kind of paradigms. I'm curious, one, if you think that that's enough, if combining those two architectures is actually
It's not enough. It's
Okay,
necessary but not
yeah,
sufficient.
that's what I was
And
thinking.
the biggest problem is the world model problem. Like, if you have neurosymbolic AI, it still doesn't tell you what world models you need. And I'll give you an analogy, which is if I told you there was this thing called a computer program and you could do a lot of stuff with it, and it's going to be really great and it's going to transform the world, I would have been right. But also, it wouldn't have told you anything about how to build a browser, what a word processor is, what a spreadsheet is, what good practice is on a file system, and so forth, right? So it is a necessary condition for modern computer programming that it be symbolic. And that really gets you a lot of leverage. It's incredibly useful. But it doesn't get you all the way there. What we need to get to AGI, in part, is a way of inducing world models. Neurosymbolic AI gives you a way of representing them, but it doesn't solve that problem.
Just a bit of a follow-up. So I was going to get to the world models. It seems representing norms and kind of like tacit knowledge is incredibly difficult to do. And you talk about like imbuing some initial models as a way to like create building blocks and get to that point. Are there any, is there any meaningful work being done or like potential avenues for building the or like automating the development of world models? Or is this kind of a pretty intractable problem?
I think it's hard that people haven't been thinking about it the right way, and I may start to think about it the right way because I think the time has come when people might actually appreciate the work.
Yeah.
I think I have time for maybe one more, or
Okay. Yeah, yep.
one last question if there is one.
Thanks. So you seem to be anti-Gen AI, but pro-AI in general. I'm curious what you think the world looks like when we get to artificial intelligence.
To artificial general intelligence?
Yeah, and do you think studying Gen AI now, for example, labor market impacts, can help us understand what the world will look like when we get to AGI?
I think the biggest lesson that we should take, most abstract lesson, is that Gen AI was kind of like a dress rehearsal for more sophisticated AI that will come someday. And we should learn that we as a society handled this dress rehearsal miserably. We gave way too much power to way too few people. Government didn't do anything to regulate it. When we get artificial general intelligence, we need to be in much better position to have solutions to the alignment problem of how we keep it safe. We need to have much tighter regulation around what we do with it. We need to think about the economic impacts. We need to think about theft of IP and how to sort of appropriately compensate people. So even if you put aside all the technical problems, I think as a society, we failed to do anything about it. And in fact, it's similar to social media, which I think has had a hugely detrimental effect on society. And we just, again, let the companies do what they want. We have Section 230 in the United States, basically shields them from liability. That was a mistake. And we should learn from this and say, we just, because of Citizens United and things like that, we're just giving way too much power to the companies, the lobbying, and so forth. This one didn't turn out that well. I think you should ask yourselves. Everybody should ask themselves. Every month or something like that. Has generative AI on net been a positive or negative? And I think if you're intellectually honest about it, it's really kind of close right now. There are some genuine applications, but there are also some genuinely negative consequences, like non-consensual deepfake porn, misinformation, etc. It's been a pretty mixed bag for society. I think we should try to do better next time, and I'll end there. Thank you.